Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our weekly research seminar here at the Hatfield Marine Science Center. Today, I'm your host. I'm the academic program manager here at Hatfield, and we have Rose, who is helping us with our online Zoom attendees. Again, this is a hybrid seminar session, so we have folks that are in-house as well as online. We ask that you, while we actually have your video and your microphones turned off, but you'll be able to chat. At the end, we will take questions at the end of the seminar, and you can put that in the chat, or you can raise your virtual hand, or for those folks who are in-house here, you can raise your hand. Couple things here related to announcements. There are a couple of really wonderful events that are coming up that I wanted to share with everyone before we get started. And one of those is we have this weekend a special event that's happening at Cascade Head. It's called Forests of the Sea. And if you're not familiar with Cascade Head, it's biosphere just north of Newport. And the Forests of the Sea event is a multi-day event this weekend, including seaweed printing and education workshop. There's also an evening talk on otters that once called them home, Forests of the Sea. And those events are happening on Saturday and Sunday, July 16th and 17th. Again, at Cascade Head, and we'll post that information in the chat as well. All right, and then finally, our next seminar next week will be from Nate Kirk, who is from the Department of Integrative Biology at Oregon State University. The title of the talk is "With Friends Like This, Who Needs Anemones? Intraspecific Competition of Anthopleura elegantissima in the Rocky Intertidal Zone." So come back to join us next week for that. All right, and that brings us to our guest speaker today. Today we have Dave Sutherland, an associate professor with the University of Oregon Department of Earth Sciences, who will be giving a seminar entitled "Buried or Fried: Understanding Sedimentation and Temperature Effects" related to the South Slough. Dave Sutherland is a coastal physical oceanographer at the University of Oregon, studying estuarine dynamics in Oregon, as well as glacial fjords in Alaska and Greenland. He received his PhD from MIT and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute Joint Program before doing postdoctoral work at the University of Washington and the NOAA Northwest Fisheries Science Center. In 2011, he joined the Department of Earth Sciences at University of Oregon. Go Ducks. Yeah. Where he is also core faculty in the environmental studies program. A native North Carolinian. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. He appreciates the Oregon coast, but his favorite beaches are ones where you can actually swim. So with that, will you join me in giving a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Dave Sutherland.
Thank you.
All right.
All right, thank you very much. This is on. You guys hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. And thanks for hosting me. This is a beautiful, beautiful building. I've been down here a couple times now, but this is the first time giving a talk in the lecture hall, so really enjoy it. As he said, you know, the talk here is a really long title, and what you notice most is maybe this whole big host of collaborators. All my work I do collaboratively with other scientists. In particular here with the South Slough research staff, so Jenny Schmidt and Allie Helms were really big. And then with Dave Ralston at Woods Hole and Emily Idem, who's actually joining the Oregon State faculty this fall. She was at UNC before, but she'll be joining Oregon State this fall, so you'll see her around. And then Molly Keogh, who's a postdoc at the University of Oregon, working with my group. And what you're looking at here is a picture of the Coos Estuary, actually looking west out of Marshfield Channel. If any of you have ever been there, looking at the town of Coos Bay. That's our little research boat in the right corner there. But you know what I'm really going to talk about today. Maybe. Here, let me get out of this. Okay. I'm going to talk about temperature a little bit at the end, but I'm going to focus on sediment dynamics. And Since 2011, I've joined the University of Oregon staff. The University of Oregon has a marine lab down in the Coos Bay region at Charleston, the Oregon Institute of Marine Biology. And so when I first started, I got really involved in trying to understand the estuarine dynamics of our local estuary, even though ironically, I think it takes me less time to get here than it does to get to Charleston. Everything good? Oh, thanks. Yep. And so this latest iteration of this project is, we've had funding from Oregon Sea Grant, NERR Science Collaborative, as well as the National Science Foundation to sort of cobble together all the research I'm going to talk about today. And as a physical oceanographer, I've started out looking at the hydrodynamics. So the salinity mainly controls what happens in the estuary. But I've gotten taken into the realm of sediment dynamics because it has a much more applied relevance to things like eelgrass and oysters and other things that people care about in these systems. Okay. Oh, I think you went out of PowerPoint again. There we go. All right. He gave me a great introduction, so I don't need to talk too much more about myself, but mainly I'm an estuarine dynamics scientist. So I study places where fresh water meets the ocean. Half my group works, excuse me, on Coos Bay and Pacific Northwest estuaries. The other half works on icebergs, which are just solid freshwater, and glacial fjords in places like Greenland and Southeast Alaska and Antarctica. This is just some pictures. My lab website there. Again, you can see the sediment influence even in these glacial fjords, right? So that's an iceberg putting sediment into the ocean. And I won't go over my background because he already gave a great introduction. Just to give you a hint at the other half of my research life. So this is a picture of LeConte Bay and LeConte Glacier in Southeast Alaska. If you've ever been to Petersburg, Alaska, south of Juneau, this is the southernmost tidewater glacier in the Northern Hemisphere. The glacier is on the right. This is the fjord extending out to the left, and I'll just play the movie. This is an estuary. There's fresh water coming out of the glacier. It drives the flow that goes seaward. And at the bottom of the fjord, you actually have landward flow towards the glacier. And so my group studies this just like any other estuary. It's a buoyancy-driven flow. There's a mixture of fresh water and salt water that drives density gradients that drives the circulation. The challenging thing, of course, is that there's calving icebergs and there's really strong currents, you might have noticed. And you can see our ship, this is from a time-lapse camera, about 500 meters above looking down at the glacier, but our ship is here, if you didn't notice it during the movie, dodging icebergs. The really challenging part of these systems is getting the observations near the glacier front where you really want to be. And so I'm working a lot with Oregon State faculty actually who develop robotic systems to actually go up to the glacier front to collect samples. And this work is actually funded by the Office of Polar Programs. And one thing I don't think I included in my bio is actually right now I'm on a stint with the National Science Foundation as a program director in the Antarctic Sciences program. So I'm a rotator. It's a temporary 2-year position. It's been remote the whole time since I started during COVID. I'm going to end this October, probably still during COVID. But I am a program director and I still do a little bit of research on the side. So that's a little pitch for NSF. Okay, but back to today's regularly scheduled talk. You came to hear about Coos Bay and the South Slough Estuary. So, just south of here, we call it the Coos Estuary to sort of differentiate it from Coos Bay, which is the town in the town of North Bend. So the Coos Estuary is a drowned river valley. It's been folded by some local tectonics. So that's why it looks like an inverted U when you look at it. And South Slough is a National Estuarine Research Reserve. It was actually the first National Estuarine Research Reserve in the whole system of 29 around the country. You can see them as green dots in the upper right there. It's one of the few on the West Coast, though. And the mission of South Slough is actually to be a sort of a research hub and a case study to understand Pacific Northwest estuaries. And I think in that vein, it's really successful at its mission, but even then, Pacific Northwest estuaries are relatively understudied compared to the East Coast sort of examples and systems, places like the Chesapeake and other places like that, the Hudson River, or the Gulf of Mexico sort of estuaries. So South Slough has been protected since the 1970s as a protected watershed. That's in contrast to the rest of the whole Coos watershed, which, like many Oregon coast range watersheds, has been heavily logged and heavily altered by human influence. But Coos Bay is a what's called a deep draft estuary. It's actually slated for industrial use, and I'll talk about that I think on this slide actually. So there's been really heavy human use in Coos Bay dating back to the 19th century, actually during Western European settlement time periods. So timber, agriculture, aquaculture, fishing, all those things are still going on in Coos Bay today. And as you'll see as I talk today, they've really altered the estuarine geometry, which has fundamentally changed the hydrodynamics and the sediment dynamics. And we think that has effects on native species. All right, but it's not just industry. Obviously, people recreate there too. So fishing, shellfishing, kayaking, lots of crabbing going on. It's also home to 3 tribes. So the confederated tribes of the Siletz, the Lower Umpqua, the Coos, Lower Umpqua, and South Slough, and then the Coquel tribes all have roots in the Coos estuary. And then, of course, you know, the estuary itself plays a role of, like many estuaries around the Oregon coast and the nation, as a nursery ground for really ecologically important species, you know, crabs, and then the eelgrass themselves are really important to the overall ecosystem. But if you ever go to Coos Bay, what you'll notice a lot are some of these really huge ships that come in and out. So it's the deepest draft port that's wholly in the state of Oregon. The Columbia River is you know, partly Washington. So it's a really interesting place to study because it has all these competing interests, both scientific to industrial to recreational, and a really committed, and I'll talk about this later too, a really committed community of stakeholders. So the project I want to talk about today, that was in the title, Buried or Fried, right? So we're talking about sediment effects on restoration projects of the Olympia oyster, as well as temperature effects or thermal stresses. Obviously, there's other things that can affect those native species, but today we're going to focus just on mostly the sediment and then get a little bit into temperature at the end. So some background. The Olympia oyster is the native oyster. You all probably know this better than me since I'm not a biologist, a physical oceanographer. It was actually naturally extirpated from the Coos estuary sometime in the 1800s, and then it came back. And since then, they've been trying to restore the native populations of Olympia oysters. You can see the presence-absence map here. If you squint at it, you can maybe see some patterns, like in the western channel. There seems to be less presence of the Olympia oyster, whereas they seem more so not present here, present in the Eastern Bay, and here's South Slough, not present in South Slough either, despite some restoration efforts going on in South Slough to try to get them back. Those have failed. So that's one. And then eelgrass. All of you are maybe aware that eelgrass decline is happening across the whole West Coast. It's happening across the whole globe. In the Coos Bay region, in the Coos estuary, these 4 stations, what I'm showing you here is a time series of mean shoot density of eelgrass, so like how many shoots there are per square meter. So more means more eelgrass. What you can basically see, and the only station where we have quarterly sampling, so really a resolved time series, is at the Volino Island time, and that's the pictures that you're seeing there. That's in the middle of South Slough, kind of mid estuary there in the southern arm. And basically you see a big die-off in 2015, 2016, right? There's some interannual variability, and then this really big die-off, and it hasn't really recovered. It looked like it was starting to recover, and then it's sort of died off again. And there's the hint that Danger, which is also in the southern part of the estuary, had a die-off as well, even though, you know, 4 points over a 20-year time period. It's hard to really, you know, put too much into that. So the big question is, well, what caused that die-off? Was it burial? Was it, you know, thermal stress? Because you might remember that around that time period, there was the blob and the marine heat wave going on offshore. Or was it something else, disease or some biological process? So that was really the goal of this study, and still is. We're still ongoing in this study. And if we take a step back, you know, when we started the previous iteration of this project 4 or 5 years ago, we wanted to look at, characterizing how sediment gets through the system. Again, because we don't really understand how sediment gets through these Pacific Northwest estuaries that well. They're very short. They're really strongly forced. By short, I mean dynamically short. So the tide takes up a relatively big portion of the estuary length. And so we wanted to build a simulation, right, a numerical model of the estuary to use for these sort of applied problems, and give it to the end users like the South Slough or the Port of Coos Bay or the Coastal Watershed Association or whoever, ODF and W, to use for their applications. That was the goal. And so I'm going to walk through a few of these project highlights just to give you a sense of where we are and where we got to, and then at the end talk about some of our current ongoing work. So, we've developed and validated a hydrodynamic. By that, I just mean a model that's a three-dimensional realistic model of the estuary. So a hindcast simulation. We're not forecasting yet, but we're looking back in time because that can give us some understanding of processes that are important. And we've now incorporated sediment into that model so we can understand where the sediment flows and fluxes through the estuary. And then we use that model to look at how the estuaries change over 150 years. So we didn't run the model for 150 years of real time. We actually used the historic geometry of the estuary and the present day geometry to compare and contrast those geometries. And I'll talk a little bit about the end users and stakeholders just because I think it's a really powerful example of how to do this sort of co-production of work in a system. And then again, just conclude at the end with some ongoing research. These are some pictures from the field in the bottom right there. Maybe I'll just point out that one. That's taking a short sediment core on one of the flats in the Coos estuary. And that's sort of the ongoing work that we're doing now that I'll talk about to look at shorter timescale seasonal sedimentation. If you want to know more about all this and look at papers and movies and links and everything, you can go to this project website, which is hosted by the NERR's Science Collaborative. And so that's the funding agency that funds our work. Okay, so here's Coos Bay. So I've talked about it a little bit, but just to orient you, this is the mouth. Here's the Pacific Ocean. The town of Coos Bay is here. North Bend is here. So if you come down to Coos Bay, right, you go over the big bridge. There's a railroad bridge here. So just orienting, South Slough is this southern arm right here. The main freshwater source actually though comes in from the east. This is the Coos River, the South Fork of the Coos River, which is the confluence of the Millicoma and the Coos River. It's a little confusing. There's multiple Coos rivers. And then there's lots of sloughs and other things around. Coal Bank Slough, they used to mine coal in parts of the hills around Coos Bay. So this is what you can see from Google Earth, right? Any of you can go to your phone and look at this map. Okay, but you see the title up there, bathymetry. What we actually want to know is like the depth of the water, right? Because if you want to build a model, a simulation of the estuary, the first thing you need is the actual depth. So, okay, great. We'll go to NOAA. Here's the map. This is the 2011 chart for Coos Bay, right? So you can get depths out of here if you wanted, but still, and we get the coastline out of this if we wanted, but it's not the best thing, right? Because there's individual depths on here, and it turns out that if you look at the, so NOAA also provides DEMs that you can download off the web, and they have bathymetry in them. But when we downloaded the one for Coos Bay back in 2012, when I first started this, modeling project, there were some really big errors, particularly in the Eastern Bay, just blatantly wrong. And so one of the first things we had to do was think about how to get better bathymetry in this system. And so we worked with Peter Ruggiero here at Oregon State, who has this great group that he runs jet skis. That have little echo sounders on the back of them. And mostly he does this work for stuff in the surf zone, right? So they're doing stuff offshore in the surf zone. But in the wintertime, they're actually looking for stuff to do because I think it's too rough out in the surf zone. And so they do work around estuaries. And so he came down and they did a lot of basically mowing the lawn, right? Of getting bathymetry and depths of the estuary around Coos Bay. So the plan transects here. So again, this is a Google Earth image. In blue, you see what we planned. In red, this is with just one survey. We did multiple. So we eventually actually got a lot of the blue areas too. In red were the lines that Peter's group actually ran with the jet skis. And jet skis sound super fun until you do about 1,000 lines of back and forth across an estuary. But they're really neat. And the other thing we could do from the jet ski that I'll talk about later on is actually grab little samples of sediment whenever we could. So they had basically little vials on the end of a stick. And we'd grab these little surface samples of sediment that go into the sediment part of the model later on as they were going around doing the bathymetric surveying. Okay, so we had that. So that's the single beam. That's the stuff in red. Luckily, in 2014, the US Army Corps actually flew a coastal Lidar. So this is a green laser. It penetrates into water. So if the water is not turbid, not too turbid, you can actually get water depths. And so they're doing it for the DEMs to build, topographic models. But in a lot of the estuary, we're able to use that to fill in some of the gaps from the other surveys. And then the Army Corps also does annual surveys because they dredge Coos Bay about every year. And so that's in the blue. And then Sea Corps is ODF and W. They were doing some bathymetric surveying to look at seagrass as well. So we were able to put all that together, and we built this map, bathymetric map of Coos Bay at 2-meter resolution. So every 2 meters, we have a really accurate depth of the estuary. And you can see, so blue is deeper, so it gets deeper offshore. And you can see the channel running. It's a really narrow channel, only maybe 100 to 200 meters wide from the mouth up around the bend all the way down and then into, so the picture that I showed you before was Marshfield Channel, which is this channel right here, looking west at Marshfield Channel. The town of Coos Bay is right here. So 0, this is in kilometers, so 0, 5, 10, 20, 25 kilometers to where sort of the freshwater enters the estuary. And then South Slough is to the south there. And South Slough is much shallower. It's sort of natural depth. It doesn't get dredged every year. The channel gets dredged to about 11 to 12 meters. And it's naturally deeper at the mouth. And this product, I mean, we thought, okay, yeah, we're going to build a bathymetry. It's so simple. We've shared this product probably 24 times with different groups around Coos Bay and around Oregon. It was really surprising how much demand there was just for a really good bathymetric product. And it did take some work, so we're happy to share it. So it is the first order input though into the model, right? So by model, I mean, we have it's a computer simulation. We're solving the equations of motion on a grid. It turns out this model that we're using is what's called an unstructured grid. So you can see it on the in the bottom left. You can't really see it in the top right just because it's so fine that you can't see the little triangles. And it's 3-dimensional. It has tidal forcing. It has salinity in it. At this point, we didn't have temperature, and we're adding temperature into the model. Temperature turns out to be less important for hydrodynamics just because the salinity is really what controls the density, and that controls the circulation. And then water level, obviously, too. So the tide's going up and down. And so it's essential. Getting the bathymetry right was really essential to us being able to validate this model. So we have a whole year-long model run, 2013 into 2014. And it has, I think, pretty good skill at actually validating with observations from the estuary. So we can predict, salinity and water level and the current magnitudes and directions really well with this model, right? So then we can ask questions about seasonal changes, what happens if you change different forcings and things like that. So it's pretty exciting. We're pretty happy that this worked. You're also putting in river forcing at the boundaries. So we have like 13 rivers going into the model. So just to show you what it looks like, this is going to be a picture of surface salinity during a winter time period in 2014. So blue, like dark purple is 0. So that's the fresh water coming in. Obviously, 35 is more like oceanic salinity. And you'll see that it kind of reminds me of a heart pumping. But so salt water comes in, right? Just tidal flow coming in and out. So, and you'll see what I meant by that. It's a really dynamic, strongly forced estuary. this is surface salinity, but pure oceanic water is making it almost up to the Big Bend, to the North Bend area, about 14 kilometers into the estuary. The other point I'll make here is that there's a lot of drying of the eastern flats. Let me play it again. So in the Eastern Bay, you'll see the model can actually let the flats dry and then re-wet every tidal cycle. But if you were to take a mean state, like an average, and try to get what an average salinity is over this, you actually get a picture that the estuary never really sees in real life, right? So that's what I mean by really strongly forced and unsteady. You know, you could take an average over this estuary and get a picture of what it might look like, but at any given moment, the estuary is actually never really experiencing that average salinity, if that makes sense. It's always, you know, at the mouth, it's always like really salty or really fresh. And if you took an average of that, it'd be something in the middle, and the estuary doesn't really ever see that. Okay, so that's what the model looks like. And so we have that at you know, every vertical level in depth, and then over about a year at hourly, actually half hourly time steps. Okay, so the next step then, now we have this model, we've got currents, we've got salinity. Okay, we got to get to sediment now. And so that's another whole step. But to get the sediment right, you first have to have the currents and the circulation right. And so you always do that first, and then you get into the sediment. And so what you're seeing here is a picture of how we incorporated sediment into the model. And the circles are observations, again, from those jet ski grab samples. So every time they were able, they took a little surface sample. And the color is actually grain size. So 0.5 is a coarse sand, so pretty coarse. And then 0.05 is like a mud grain size. So you're going from like fine muds like silts and clays up to coarse sand as you go from blue to red. Okay, and the first thing you might say is like, oh wow, there's a lot of variability there, right? But if you zoom in on different parts, right, the channel looks like it's coarse, and that makes sense because really strong currents don't let the fine stuff settle out, right? They erode that away. And the flats and the upper estuary, the up estuary parts look a little bit finer. Okay, so that's where all the fine material is settling out, is up in the on the flats, and then up estuary. So those are the circles. In the background is actually what the model predicts after we let it run to a steady state to sort of initiate our sediment model. And again, if you kind of squint at it, and we did a much more quantitative validation of it, it does a reasonably good job at getting this sort of base state of what the sediment looks like on the in the surface layer on the bottom. So that's good. All right, so again, now we have a model that does circulation. It's got a bed that kind of looks right. And then the only other thing you need are, again, the boundary conditions. So you need to put sediment into the rivers that are coming in. All right. But just to show you what this looks like now. So what I'm going to show you again is a little movie. On the top is two things: the time series of how we forced the model. So the red is just the tide, right? So this is the tide going up and down. And the blue is an idealized river forcing, right? So there's a base river, and then it'll go up and back down during a sort of a event, right? A big a storm. So Coos Bay a lot like all the other estuaries around here, are really episodic. Okay. And then what you're going to see in the bottom right, just focus on the bottom right movie for now, is the present day depth average suspended sediment concentration, right? So this is how much sediment is in the water column at a given time. So if I just play it, you'll see, you know, so the line up top is going through the forcing. As the river discharge goes up, you'll see more sediment come into the system, right? And it's primarily coming out of the main river, which is the Coos River here, and down the channel and up out of the estuary. You'll also see a couple other things though, as you go through the tide. You might notice in South Slough and other parts of the estuary, everything kind of lights up and then gets darker, lights up, gets darker. That's just when the tidal currents get strong, you resuspend sediment from the bed, and then that settles back down. So basically every tide, you're resuspending sediment, and that can move and get settled back down. So there's two big things going on, right? There's that resuspension and movement, and then there's the supply of sediment from the rivers into the estuary. Okay, but you might be wondering, okay, what's this thing on the left? Like that, it looks kind of like Coos Bay, but maybe a little bit different. That's the historic case. And so that's where I'm going to get into next of how we compared and contrasted, what was happening in Coos Bay 150 years ago to what was happening at present day. Okay, and how we did that is we had an undergrad go look for all the old maps you could find of Coos Bay. So this is there was actually an 1861 NOAA map that she found in the UO library and digitized. It didn't have as many depths on it as this 1895 one, but 1861 was actually before they built the jetties. By 1895, they were already hardening the mouth of the estuary, which you can see here. But there's no Charleston, there's no Charleston Harbor, there's no airport, and I'll get into these changes in a little bit. But so I think we have 10 or 11 maps between 1895 and 1861 and then 2011, sort of documenting this change in the estuary over time. All right, and it took a lot of work on her part to digitize these and get them into GIS and grid them. But we did that. And this is sort of a summary of the changes. So I can try to walk you through what's happening here. It's maybe a little hard to see, but luckily the screen is big. So just focus in on what you're seeing in blue, and the background map is actually the 1895 NOAA chart. And then the purple line is the 2011 shoreline. Okay, and so these different areas sort of zoom in on different places. So in the bottom left is at the mouth and near Charleston. And you can see the sort of the building of the Charleston Harbor, the building of the jetties. South Slough, kind of the mouth to South Slough got a little bit narrower. Up near North Bend and the bridge, you'll see, they built the airport. They expanded the airport after some time. They built out into Pony Slough. And then where it says port, they also, that's Jordan Cove, actually, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. That's the proposed site of that liquid natural gas terminal that now is hopefully finally not going to happen. And then on the bottom right is in the Eastern Bay, and you'll see there's some dredge spoil islands, and they also reclaimed a lot of land down here for agriculture, and then along this edge here too. Okay. So a lot of really big changes, and what happened actually is the estuarine area actually decreased, from 58 square kilometers down to about 51 square kilometers over that 150-year time period. So what does that mean for sedimentation? And by that, it actually means okay, what does that mean for the hydrodynamics and the circulation? Because that might actually drive a lot of change in sedimentation. You can have source effects too, right? If there's a change in the source of sediment, and that might be caused by changes in logging or other things. But here we're focused mostly on the changes because of the geometry. So to get at that, we actually devised a few different simulation experiments. So we built geometries based on the historic case. So that's on the left here. And interestingly, even though the area was bigger in the 19th century, the volume was only about 80% of the current volume. Okay, so the estuary got a lot deeper, even if the channel got narrower. Okay, I didn't do that. Oh, don't do that. Minimize, okay. Hopefully that's still good. So you can see that the estuary looked like it does in the present day. In the historic case, it just wasn't as deep as they dredged it out down to 37 feet or about 11 to 12 meters. And then the proposed case, which this study we did a few years ago before they decided to not do the Jordan Cove project, they were going to widen and deepen the channel even more to allow the really big tankers in for LNG. And so we wanted to see okay, well, we can look backwards. We can also look forward in time and see what changes would happen if you actually did that, that deepening, widening of the channel. Okay. And so I'm just going to give you the main highlights here. When you change the geometry of an estuary, you're fundamentally changing the circulation regime. And so between the historic and present day, one of the biggest changes was how the fresh water was routed out into the estuary. And so you can see in the historic case, there was no real marsh field channel. Coos River came out and it dumped its sediment across this really big delta and all these flats. Okay, so the red there is where the sediment was getting dumped out into the estuary. Okay, there was less of a channel system. In the present day case, they've dredged this channel that hugs the shore here, and even Marshfield Channel and down into Catching Slough here, and then the Coos River comes out. So you see that the sediment stays very concentrated into that channel and makes it into the main channel along its edge there. And so you have this fundamental change in where the sediment is getting routed into the system. I mean, and well, I'll get into that later on, but there was also really big changes in the circulation. The tidal amplitude actually has increased in present day, but the tidal currents have actually decreased because the volume and the depth of the estuary got bigger. And so there's some really interesting sort of non-intuitive changes that have happened over this time period. Okay, so what I'm showing now here is another highlight, and on the top is the historic sort of channel. So now you're looking at depth versus distance up estuary, and the color is the sediment concentration. Okay, so the mouth is on the left and you're going up estuary. In the historic case, you can kind of see less sediment overall. And the black lines show you isohalines. So those are salinity contours. In the present day case, right, it's deeper. Marshfield Channel's on the right coming out, and then you go over this step where they dredge down fairly deep, and you can see there's a much bigger sediment concentration there, and that's what we call an ETM, or an estuarine turbidity maximum. Okay, and that's set up not just because more of the sediment is getting pumped into that area, but also because we've changed the salinity structure so much that there's an estuarine exchange flow now that traps sediment in that area, right around where Marshfield Channel enters the main channel. All right, and so now we are sort of trapping the sediment in that main channel instead of allowing it to go across the big delta flats on the East Bay. Okay, and so what are the implications of that? Well, this is sort of a summary slide of what happens. Basically, that there's more retention in the present day case than there was in the past. Okay, so what you're seeing is the change in bed mass, and the blue is historic, the red is present, and the gray is the proposed case. But the biggest changes are between the historic and the present day. So in the Thalweg, which is the main channel, it used to actually be net erosional, so sediment was getting put out into the ocean. In the present day, it's net depositional, so sediment is getting stored in the estuary in that main channel, which explains why they have to dredge it every year. But what I thought was more interesting was actually in the East Bay and in the sort of South Slough region and the sloughs, Haynes Inlet to the north, there's actually more retention too, which to me was counterintuitive, because I thought, the sediment is getting pumped not into those regions, but into the main channel, right? And so what we found actually, what's happening is, so sediment's coming up the main channel, and there's a lot of lateral circulation that's then pushing that sediment. It's still making it on the flats, it's just making it in a different area of the flat. So less down here and more actually on the northern flats and Haynes Inlet and within South Slough. So you're still getting more retention even in the present day case on those flats in the sloughs than the historic case. And some of that has to do with the overall circulation as well. Okay, great. So that was the sort of the highlights of the sediment dynamics. And then I think one thing I think Coos Bay is a really good example of is the stakeholder group they have, which is called the Partnership for Coastal Watersheds. And this is a grassroots group that we work with really closely, and that drives some of the research that we do. So why were we looking at those particular regions of where sediment was depositing, or those sorts of things? Well, it was driven by these stakeholders that are part of this group, and they meet monthly, and they've been meeting for probably over 15 years. And it includes industry, so it includes the Port of Coos Bay, includes the towns, includes ODF&W, includes the Coastal Watershed Association, and as well as scientists and others. So it's a really diverse group with sometimes competing interests, and the tribes too. That's Don Ivy there in the top right and top middle. Sorry, from the CTC. So I think it's a great model. So if you're thinking about how to get groups going to think about, community-led research, I think looking at what the partnership does is a really good model. That's just my plug for them. And so what they've enabled us to do is say, so we're not just writing scientific papers about this and publishing it to 10 people who are going to read our academic papers, but we're also, giving them deliverables, things like GIS layers of salinity and sediment, the bathymetric data set. Once we get temperature in the model, they're really interested in that, right? Because all of a sudden temperature, you can think about salmon and other fish, as well as some other ecosystem level sort of effects. So, it's really driven our research, and hopefully it's been useful to them too. And then I'll just touch briefly on some continuing research that we're building on from the stuff I just showed. So if we go back to this picture I showed you some results from our sediment model. And so, what we're doing now on the sediment model is, well, I'll get into that right here, is we're actually doing a lot of sediment cores. So we've taken, by deep cores, I mean about a meter. So you can take a core that's about a meter long, and you can look back about 125 years in certain areas, depending on the sedimentation rate in time of what that sediment accumulation rates are. And then we're also taking short cores, about 10 centimeter cores, and we did those for monthly over a year. And with those, we're using this beryllium-7 isotope that lets you look at sort of seasonal timescale deposition of sediment. And so, the previous stuff was more about long-term change, and now we're getting more into seasonal to interannual changes in sediment to really try to understand how sediment moves through the system. Because what we're finding from the sediment accumulation rates is that there's a really neat interannual trend that maybe mimics some larger scale forcing, things like when the peak of logging was in the 1940s and 50s. You see a change in sediment accumulation rate in the estuary. And so we can start piecing together that story a little bit more, rather than just the really big change from the geometry. The other thing we're doing is looking at temperature, and that's what's meant by SWAMP. That's just an acronym from the South Slough, the National Estuarine Reserve System. I kind of even forget what it's something about their water monitoring program. It's all their time series observations. So all these little red stars are places where they monitor temperature, salinity, nutrients, pH, turbidity, oxygen, things like that. And so you can use that data. It's all freely available to do sort of analyses that you're interested in. And so what we're looking at now, right, is temperature. So we're doing the observational analysis now, and then we'll start adding it to the model. Temperature is a little bit harder in the model because, salinity is fairly easy because the rivers come in at zero salinity, and you got your ocean, and that's it. Temperature, all of a sudden, you need the river temperatures, you need the ocean temperatures, and you need the atmospheric heat flux too. And so it gets a little bit harder. But this is observations. So what you're seeing again is that same time series of eelgrass density on top. And in the bottom, what you're seeing is water temperature from 4 different stations. So Stonewall Buoy is offshore. The Charleston station is the closest to the mouth. Okay, so you can see that here. Here's Charleston. Velino is in the middle of South Slough, and then Winchester is down here near the upper estuary side of South Slough. And this is multiple years, right? This is like 14 years of data. You see the big seasonal change, right? So up and down with the seasons, but then you might also, start noticing some interannual variability. In particular, maybe something that pops out are these really warm winters in 2015 and 2016, when temperatures in the estuary didn't get really below 10 degrees, whereas in other winters it was much colder. There's also some warmer temps in some of these summers too. So it's really tempting just to be like, oh yeah, that explains everything. But we know it doesn't, because, what's interesting about this plot, right, is that Velino, which is in the middle of South Slough, started decreasing in 2015, whereas Danger, which is up estuary, which you might expect to be more forced by, maybe some of the heat waves or river forcing, didn't decrease until after 2016 at least. And then what I'm not showing here is some other data from ODF&W in the main channel of seagrass beds that haven't shown any real trend at all over that same time period. And so we're trying to piece apart all these spatial trends in eelgrass, and it's not such a simple temperature story. So because everything varies together, right? You know, the water temperature, the air temperature, the river discharge, all these things aren't independent of each other. They're sort of responding to the same large scale climate trends going on. You know, because you can look at river discharge, which is this gray curve, and you have some really low discharge years in 2013, 2014, and even 2015 a little bit compared to the norm. So it's kind of tempting to look at those and say, well, what, you know, if you have low discharge, what does that mean for the estuary? Would that have caused distress to the eelgrass? So, you know, we're trying to sort this all out for the Coos Bay, where we have, you know, we have a lot of data, and now we have this model too. So hopefully we can make some headway. All right, so that's it. I'm sort of out of time. I think the summary here is that the sediment temperature dynamics, which I haven't shown temperature, but we'll get there, vary over really multiple time and space scales, right? Coos Bay is a really dynamic estuary. You need a lot of observations to validate a model that then you hope you believe and does a good job. So the basic data are really critical to even begin tackling those sort of policy related questions. And then I'll just, you know, also end on, there's a lot of other difficulties, obviously, like when you work with stakeholders and end users in the public, there's a lot of questions about how to translate your science the best way. And also like this lesson of overpromising, right? We've been working on this model for 10 years now, and you know, it's still a work in progress, like most of science. So we're getting there. So it's best to focus on really simple, realistic goals and just be honest with the stakeholders about what you can and can't do. So that's it. Thank you.
Do we have questions in the room or online? Right. Turn lights on.
Yeah.
Thanks. So this is really, really cool. And I was just wondering if you were familiar with the work out of Puget Sound and Chesapeake, where they've coupled hydrodynamic models to seagrass productivity models. The big gotcha is sort of the light field.
Yeah.
I'm getting that part correct, but
yeah,
this is a beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, we haven't done that ourselves, but we are aware. We're working with some people at Oregon State, actually, who have a parallel project on wetlands and eelgrass and marshes too, on blue carbon sort of data sets. And so we're sort of in tandem with them. And then, see, she's now a postdoc at the Puget Sound Institute, but I think she did her PhD at Oregon State. Caitlin Nagel did some work on seagrass. And so we're starting to work with her on exactly that thing. How do you couple a model like this to an eelgrass? Or basically you need nutrients in there too. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, cool. Thanks. Yeah, that's great.
Online question from Dan. Could you go back over how the salinity was measured for the inputs into the model? And could you mention what kind of instrumentation was used?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just show this slide because it has a map. So the model, for salinity inputs into the model, right, you need an initial condition. So we have the bathymetry, but then you need to initiate the salinity somehow. So the rivers come in at 0 salinity, that's easy. For the offshore, which I'm not really showing here, right, but our model has a boundary in the ocean somewhere too. And we take the oceanic salinities actually from a bigger model that comes out of UW. And they're modeling the whole Northwest Ocean, so including Puget Sound and the Salish Sea. So that's what's forcing our offshore. And then what we do is we basically let the model evolve on its own, and we look at all these observational points. So the ones in South Slough, Charleston, Velino, Winchester. You'll see some other acronyms here: EMP, BLM. These are 2 water quality stations maintained by the tribes. And then over here in Coquel, another one maintained by the Coquel tribe. So then what we do is we try to match the salinities that we simulate with those observed, and we hope that they do a good job. They do okay. Our model is actually biased a little bit fresh by about half PSU on average, but yeah, That's how we get so they're just standard. South Slough uses like water quality sondes like YSIs. If they're familiar with that. Yeah. So hopefully that answered his question.
So I remember you showed on the map that there's only a few estuarine research reserves on the Pacific coast currently, and there are far less in comparison to the East Coast. And I wanted to ask, do you know if there are any efforts underway to create new estuarine research reserves along the West Coast?
That's a good question. I don't know any efforts underway. No. Yeah, I don't know when the latest one. It's a good question though. Yeah, I actually don't know. I'd have to look it up.
It's okay.
I mean, certainly there's other estuaries that get studied a lot, and they're usually located where, like Yaquina Bay, right? Like they're co-located with academic institutions. Whether or not they're National Estuarine Reserve is another thing, but you know, so there's certainly other, like Puget Sound is a great example of a place that gets studied a lot. But an estuarine reserve, it comes along with a lot of resources too, right? Like they're monitoring, which can sometimes be harder to get money to do as a scientist, right? If you want long-term observations. Yeah. So yeah, good question though.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions?
This is from Rod online. It was mentioned that internal mixing within the estuary was changed from historical to present conditions. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, maybe I can show an extra slide I have here. So what happened? So this is going to be a little movie on a long estuary is along X and then depth. So color is salinity. And so if I'll just play it. So what you're seeing is, again, you're seeing the tidal motion go in and out, and then the blue line is when a river discharge event occurs. I don't think I can. Let me get out of laser pointer mode and just pause it in a second here. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Go back. Okay, did it pause? I'll just go forward in time. Okay, so if you look at like this time period, right? So this is like a right after a big ebb tide, right? So in the historic case, it looks like fresh water is almost out to the mouth, right? But in the present and proposed case, the depth has changed so much that you still have, it's during a neap tide, and so there's still a lot of stratification. And you have salt all the way, almost all the way still up, 20 kilometers inland. And so that's one of the biggest changes, is that the salt intrusion is actually lengthened in the present day case compared to the historic case. And that's what's led to that formation of the ETM as well. And it's interesting, actually, I'll just mention that in the proposed case, even though it's just a small change in depth, like a few meters and a little bit of widening compared to like the difference between the historic and present, the proposed case actually lengthens that salt intrusion even more by about another few kilometers. And that can have, pretty significant impacts on ecosystems if your salinity regime suddenly changes. So we'll see what happens with that. But that's what I meant by changes to the salinity structure. So hopefully that helped.
This is from John. Great presentation. How old are the sediments over the range of the bay? Has the development of and dredging affected undiked tidal flats significantly? And does the dredging cause tidal flats to erode? It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, how old the sediments are. I mean, it really depends where you are. So the sedimentation rates in Coos Bay are, anywhere from 1 to 2 millimeters per year up to like a couple centimeters per year in certain areas. And so depending on where you go core or look, you can go back further in time or less in time. I think, one important point, I guess, to make on that front is that the sedimentation rates in Coos Bay are greater than or equal to relative sea level rise. So Coos Bay seems to be keeping up with sea level. And in fact, if you think about sea level rise in Coos Bay over like the next century and how much maybe extra water or volume that would add to the estuary compared to dredging or like the next big earthquake, which would, create another meter of space, like it's pretty small. It's like an order of magnitude or maybe 2 orders of magnitude smaller. So sea level rise rates are So the estuary seems to be doing okay. That's not to say that around the edges of some of these wetlands, though, or flats, that there is some erosion going on. And the biggest thing about trying to find the core sites in Coos Bay was actually trying to find a site that wasn't altered by humans, actually. So like, because they just put dredge spoils everywhere. So it's been really hard to find natural sites to core. Because if you core through dredge, right, you're not actually getting any real signal. Yeah.
Questions in the room?
How available is y'all's model? Like, does anyone need to know specifically about it? Could you just Google it, or do they need to contact you guys?
Yeah, there's information about it on like our website, and then we have like a GitHub page too. But to get the model fields, you would just email us and we would give you the field. They're in netCDF format and they're fairly large, and so we don't store them online, but we're happy to share them. Yeah. So yeah, they're public.
Caitlin, there was just a new NERS just established on the East Coast, Connecticut. Pew Charitable Trust was at one point interested in helping to establish a new reserve on the West Coast. Not sure where the effort is.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, she's just answering his question, I think. Yeah.
Any other questions from in the room? Okay, well, wanted to thank you. This actually is a great presentation for our interns who are here.
Yeah.
Caitlin actually was one of our RU interns
really?
here. So that was really wonderful. And then we have a bunch of interns who we're taking on a coastal field tour of the Southern Oregon coast, and we'll be hitting the South
You're
Slough
going to South Slough. Great.
National Estuary Research Reserve.
Nice.
I'm wondering when we do go visit,
Yeah.
and is there a particular thing that you would want us to ask or even observe down there with that group?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. If you go to the visitor center, you can walk out, and I mean, I think the cool thing to see is some of the restored wetlands they've done, right? So in like there's so many diked and reclaimed areas in Coos Bay. They've been trying to restore some of those areas, so getting rid of tidal dikes and letting the sort of seawater come back in. So if you can see any of those in South Slough, that's really neat. And then you can see just the gradient, right? So if you go over the Charleston Bridge, you see the mouth of South Slough. You'll see these really sandy, coarse, sediments there. And if you go all the way up, where the visitor center is and hiking back there, you'll see really fine sediments and sort of marshy areas, Kunstmarsh. And so it's kind of neat. It's a compact sort of analogy for the whole estuary in one smaller system. So yeah, hopefully you can see some of it. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us in person and online. And this is recorded, so you can look for the recording of this on our past seminar page at the bottom of our website. Thank you again for all joining us. And would you just join me with another last thank you to Dave?